Welcome to the VB Toolbox. In this tutorial I will be showing you how to modify database records directly from a DataGrid view. In this tutorial I will be using SQL Server CE, that's a compact edition, but you can use whatever database you prefer. As long as you have an ADO connection to that, you should be able to follow along still. I will be creating my standard SqlControl class. If you already have that from watching one of my previous tutorials, you can just copy and paste the code into the same class in this tutorial and skip ahead. And also, if you already have a database, then you can also skip the database creation portion of this video. But let's go ahead and get started. I am going to add a new project. And I will name this project DGV for DataGridView Update. And you can call yours whatever you like. Make sure you have a Windows Forms application selected and click OK to generate your project template. I'm going to add two controls for this tutorial. I'm going to use a DataGrid view. Select that from your toolbox and drop it on your form. And you can stretch that out however you like. I'm just going to dock that to the top. Let me get rid of my exceptions window there. First off, if you click on it and select it, you can change the name. I'm going to change it to something a little more simple to call upon. I'm just going to call it DGV for DataGridView Data. Then I'm going to go down to the dock property and just dock it to the top of my window. By selecting dock from the drop down, I'll select the top dock and that'll just snap it to the top of our form. Go ahead and stretch your form out a little. That's what docking does. It makes it just stick to the edges of the form. Next up, I want to add a SqlCommand button which will be used to save our data when we're done modifying it. Stretch that down a little bit. And this button I'm going to name CMD Save. And I will change the caption text on that to Save. Alright, and that's all the controls that we'll be using in this tutorial. Next step, I'm going to create a very simple database to store some records in that we can pull into our DataGrid view. Again, I'm going to be using SQL Compact Edition. You can use whatever you have, or skip this part of the video if you already have something in use. I'll put some links in the About section so you can kind of jump to the next parts of the video. To work with SQLce, we need a reference to the SQL Server CE library. So to add that, what we'll do is we'll right-click, we'll go to our Solution Explorer, right-click on our project header and select Add Reference. And if you go to the .NET tab and order your column component name by clicking on that, we can scroll down to system.data. And I want to select SQL Server CE 3.51 and click OK. And now that library is attached to our project and we can call upon it as desired. So next up, we want to add a database to our project. To do this, I'm going to right click on my project header, select Add New Item, and if we go down to the Data section and select Local Database, it will automatically generate a SQL Server Compact 3.5 database. And the beauty of these little guys is that it's a single file. There's no server to install and manage. Very simple stuff. Limitations, it lacks some of the features and functionality of, you know, a server database installation. And some of the more advanced commands like selecting cases and stuff from within the database, your SQL code, some of those options don't exist for this, but for the purposes of this tutorial, this should really be fine. I think there's like a 4 gig data limit on these. They really are an amazing and simple database structure to use, and you can just kind of port it with your project, which is really nice. Anyway, enough of that. I'm going to go ahead and just name my database mydb.sdf and select add. And it'll bring up this wizard when you do this. A lot of people like to use the wizards to set up their database. I prefer to do everything in code so we learn more from it and how it works. I'm going to go ahead and just cancel out of this wizard, and it'll leave a database in your project. And next up, if we open that, we can right click and open, and it'll bring up your Server Explorer over here with an empty database that it created for your project. For the tables, I'm just going to add a single table here, create table, and I'm just going to call this food. You can call yours whatever you like. And for the first column, I'm just going to create an ID column, and I'm going to make that an integer. And allow nulls, no, it's going to be a primary key, and it must be unique because I'm going to set this field to auto increment. So if you select identity down here, it will make it an auto incrementing field, and every time you add a record to your database, it will increase that value. So if you want to do that and you forget to do it at this step, you're in trouble, because once you create your table, it won't allow you to come back here and change this identity increment. So you have to drop the table and recreate it from scratch, which is a kind of a real pain. I don't know why they did that, but anyway, make sure if you're going to do that, make sure you set it now. Next column, I'm just going to call food name, and leave the invar_char value and make it 30 characters long. Allow nulls. No, I don't want nulls in my main field here. It does. Well, this one can be unique. I only want one food type or one food name in this table. And next up, I'll have food type. Okay, and I'm going to make that one also just a 30 character invar_char. And I will just allow nulls. It doesn't need to be unique, because you could have multiple types of a single food, or multiple types for foods. So we'll click OK, and our database is created. Pretty simple stuff. That's why I love it so much. Next up, we will create our SqlControl class. I like to create this class. You don't have to. You can put all of your SQL code in your main form if you want, but I think it keeps it cleaner and gives you sort of a central place to manage your SQL connections and whatnot. I really like doing it this way, so I'm going to go again to my Solution Explorer and add a class, and I'm going to name this class SQLControl. And again, if you followed my other videos, you may already have a copy of my SQLControl code that I commonly use. I think in some of the older ones there has been some variations. I've done it a little differently. In my recent ones, I pretty much keep it standard. So you can either copy that over or follow along or skip ahead. And I'm going to go ahead and click Add. And because we added a reference to the SQLCE library, I can now import that library into my class here. So I can say system.data, and then I can say imports system.data.SQLCE SQL Server CE, and now we have access to all of this library's functions and methods. So first and most important is our SQL connection. So I'm going to create a private variable called SqlCon as a new, and it's important to specify that it's new if you want it to automatically generate this SQLCE connection. And I'm going to add a one very important parameter, and that's our connection string. To connect to any database, through Visual Basic, you need to know the connection string, and each type of database has its own connection string, and you want to look that up if you're using something other than SQLce. You may already have one in your project, and you can use that. So for SQLce, we have to specify a data source. So we say data source equals, and we are just going to point to mydb.sdf. So mydb .sdf, and we will close that with semicolon and close our string. And now we should have the ability to establish a connection to our database. Very simple. Next up, also very important, is our SqlCommand. This is how we will fire commands at our database. So I'm going to say private SQLCMD as new SqlCommand. SQLce command for me, sorry. Actually, I do not want to create a new one. Every time I run a query, I'm going to create a new command, so let's leave it like that. We can make a little note for ourselves. Connection, and now we need ways to manage the SQL data once we connect, so have a little area for that. I'll make these public because I want to be able to access them from my main form or any other class that I desire. So first one I'm going to create is the DataAdapter. Alright, and this is it manages the data and commands as they are pushed from our application. So I'm going to say as a SQL, keep forgetting the C. I'm used to working with SQL Server, so SQL DataAdapter, and I need a SQL a data set now to actually store the data that we pull from the database in memory. So, whoops, I call that one SQLDS as a data set. All right. Now, something I usually like to add in is query parameters. It makes it more professional. We won't actually be using them in this tutorial, but if you want to just go ahead and do this so you have a copy of the ability to add parameters to your queries and updates, it's much more professional and allows you to, it helps you prevent SQL injection attacks and things like that. I'm going to go ahead and add it in just so you guys will have a copy of this for future use. Query parameters. I just make a list of parameters and add them into my SqlCommand as desired. So I'll say public and params as a new list. So we create a list connection of SqlCe parameters. And another thing I like to use is some query statistics. I like to capture the number of records affected if I'm running a query. Again, probably not applicable to this tutorial because when you update through DataGrid, it doesn't actually return the record count or exceptions. So this is just if you want it, again for future use. Query statistics, and the first one will be public record count as integer and public exception as a string. Just things I like to have in here. I think that should be good. Okay, so now for another very important part, we need a method or a sub to execute our queries against the database, and this we will definitely be using. So say a public sub exec query, execute query, and here we'll pass the query string in as a parameter. So I'll say query as string. And now that we have this, we can do a try catch. So if there are any errors in our queries, we can capture those errors, and instead of crashing our application, it will return them gracefully. So sorry about all the noises, getting a lot of messages here. So first thing we do is open a connection to the database. So we say SqlCon.open. And I like to follow that directly with an SqlCon.close, just so we don't accidentally forget to do that, because it's important to close our connections when we're done with them. Otherwise, it may cause problems when we try to run a second query against the database. So first up here, we need to create our SqlCommand. And to do this, all we have to do is say SqlCMD equals a new SqlCe command, and we push the query through that command from our parameter, and we open the SQL connection, or we use the open SQL connection. That's all there is to it. Now, if you want to use the params, your command parameters, let's say load parameters into SqlCommand. And here I'll just call upon my list of params, and I'm going to condense this down into a lambda statement. Takes a few different, I can condense several lines of code into a single line. So just say params, and I use the for each method to loop through the list. Then I create a nameless sub inside of here, sub x, and what it does is for each item that it finds, or each parameter that it finds in this list, that is x, and so it executes a desired code or statement for each one that it finds. So what I'd like to execute is SqlCommand .parameters .add, and I just want to dump those into my SqlCommand. It has its own list that it can use for that, so it just kind of keeps it clean and simple. You could add those individually if you wanted, but let's see. And once we're done dumping the list of parameters into our SqlCommand, I like to purge that list so it's ready to go for future queries, anything else that comes after the fact. So, whoops, sorry, my timer cut off there. Clear the parameter list. To do this, it's very simple. I just say params.clear. Alright. Now I want to execute our query or command. So I execute command and fill my data set. Alright. So what we're going to do is first create a new data set. So I say SQLDS equals new data set. Nice and easy. Next up, I want to create a new SQL DataAdapter and execute the command with that adapter. So I'm going to say SQLDA equals new SQLCE command. SQLCE DataAdapter, and for the parameter, I'm just going to dump in my SqlCommand. So here we create our command, add our parameters, clear the parameters list, and create a data set, and then a data adapter, and execute the command. And if you want to keep track of how many records are found or affected, we just say record count equals SQL DataAdapter, SQLDA, sorry about that, SQLDA, and we call the fill method, and we dump the data that it finds into our data set, SQLDS, using that parameter. Now, when we call this fill method, it's kind of weird how we're setting this to equal a method, but this actually is a function that returns an integer value based upon how many records it finds or updates. So I just like having that. So we've already closed the database here. Now to catch any exceptions that we have, if we have any errors in one of our SQL queries, we can say exception equals EX, being the exception, dot message. Now, in the event that there is an error, an exception, what will happen is this, as it's running through our execution here, it may make it through the connection open and get down here and fail on our query. And what will happen is it'll automatically jump down to the exceptions, record the exception, and then exit the sub. So if that happens, it skips over this close command. We need to make sure that the database is closed in the event that that happens. So we'll just say if SQLCon.state is still open, then close it. Just a little fail-safe there. Okay, and that concludes our SQLControl class. Now we should be able to fire various commands and queries at our database. So I'm going to go ahead and save my work here. And now we can jump back to our form. So let's go ahead and begin coding on our form here. I'm just going to double click my form header and go in here. And the first thing I want to do is establish a new instance of my SQLControl class. An easy way to reference that. So we're going to create a private variable called SQL as a new. Remember new, it's very important, otherwise you'll get those null pointer exceptions. Say SQLControl. And that generates a new new copy of this class for us in memory and that we can work from. So from there, we are ready to begin our query execution, and we are also going to want to be able to load our data grid with the results from our query. So I'll say execute query and populate grid. So here we'll say SQL dot execute query, and again, you know, we're going to keep this very simple for this tutorial. We'll say select star from food. This is not case sensitive, by the way. It's just my programming habits. So that fires the execute query. It runs through here. If you have parameters, it adds them. Otherwise, it just skips over. And should return a record count. And if it was successful, we could just try this message box SQL dot record count. And if I have any records in my database, then it should find them. Now we haven't added any, so we're going to want to try that. Let's see. Let's go back to our database real quickly. I'm just going to jump in there into my table, right click on my food table and show data, and it's all empty. So let's just add some goodies in here. I'm just going to say banana is a fruit, roast beef is a meat, chicken, meat, apple, fruit, pie, dessert, Okay, so that should be good. Now let's go ahead and run our project again and see if that's working properly. As you notice, we should have 5 records found when our query executes, so we know that our query is executing successfully. Now what if I said select star from foods? I don't have a foods table, so it's not going to be happy. It found 0 records, and something it didn't show was the exception. So what if we did this? Message box SQL.exception. The specified table does not exist, foods, so notice how it crashed out gracefully, but our application still comes up. It's nice not having your application bomb on you. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this little test, and now we are going to need a sub to populate the data grid. So I'm going to do, let's see, we're going to set the data source on the data grid, and we're going to set the first row in that data grid if records are found to be the index of the first row, because we want a selected record. I guess you don't have to have that. So let's do this. We'll say private sub load grid. Don't need any parameters on that. And here we'll say if SQL.recordCount is greater than 0, then take our DataGridView data source equals SQL dot DataSet, SQL DataSet dot tables, and we take the first table in that array generally. Not sure of any circumstances where you'd have more than one table in there, but specify your first table, and DataGridView dot data dot rows, set it to the first row that it finds and select it. So we have a selected row in our table. I just like doing that. Alright. Let's just try executing our load grid and see if that's working properly. Oops, it's not going to because I forgot to fix my statement here. Let's try that. Look at that. So our data grid is now pulling data from our database. Now, what if we want to update these records? Can't really do anything yet. If we close that out, open it back up, you'll notice there are no changes. So what we need to do is create an update command and attach that to our SQL DataAdapter. Okay? So what we will do is say SQL.SQLDA, that's our data adapter, .update command equals a new SQLCE, oops, sorry, new SQLCE, why is that not working? SQL Server, wow. .SQL CE command builder is what we want. And I'll say SQL.SQL data adapter. That's specifying the data adapter we want to create a SQL command on. And then we'll tell it to get update command. And what this does is it dynamically generates an update script or update SQL statement for all of the records that you've modified in your table or in your data grid. So that's really handy. I mean, you would not want to have to hand code it for, you know, every updated cell in your data grid. That'd be a pain. So this is a nice thing that allows us to auto-generate that update command based upon whatever records were changed in our data grid and send them back to the database. So let's put a little note up here, say if our data is returned. I think I'm getting tired here, I can't type anymore. And populate grid and build update command. Nice to have little notes for yourself to go back and look at. And let's see. So once we've generated our update command, then we can just call the update method from our DataAdapter, and it should update the database with that. So what we're going to do is attach that to our save button. Now when we start it up, we haven't actually changed any data, but our save button is active. I like to just deactivate that to you know, make it not look like it's ready to save data that hasn't been changed. So what I'm going to do is say disable save button, and I'm just going to say cmd save dot enabled equals false. Alright. Piece of cake. Alright. So now that we've done that, when do we want to actually enable that button? How about whenever a cell is changed, a cell value is changed, or if a row is removed from our data grid, if we delete something. So what we can do is double click on our DataGrid view here, and it'll generate a cell content click. That's not really what we want. So let's go up here from there and select a cell value changed event. Let's see, cell value changed. There we go. I can get rid of that. So if a cell value is altered, then go ahead and enable our save button. So let's say cmd save dot enabled equals true. And let's do that also for removed rows. So if we say, come back up here, go down to rows removed. The rows removed event right here, and that will generate that event for us. And we'll say cmd save dot enabled again. Alright. And now that we have that, we should be able to begin actually set our DataAdapter's update method to that save button. So if we jump back out to our form and double click on our save button, it will generate a click event for that. And first thing we'll do is save updates to the database. And to do this, let's say SQL and the DataAdapter, and we will call its update method. And we have to select the data set that we want to update. And the data set that we're updating is what we set as the data source in the DataGrid view. So we're going to use SQLDS. Whoops, we have to call SQL. SQL.SQL dataset. Okay. And at this point, something to keep in mind is that we don't have any error checking. So if we try updating something or sending data, a data size that's too big for our database. You know how I set the fields in my database to be like 30 characters. You can kind of see that. If I sent 31 characters or 40 characters, it's going to bomb out on me. It's not going to be happy about that. So you might throw this in a try catch or something. Something to consider. Some sort of error handling or data validation is always a good thing. Alright, I'm not going to cover that in this tutorial, just trying to speed things up here. So after we've updated our database, we want to refresh the data grid, make sure that our changes are visible. So we'll say refresh grid data. And this is very simple. We'll just recall our load grid sub. So it's just going to re-execute this. And repopulate our grid. And finally, after we save, well, we enabled our save button, so since we've already made changes, let's go ahead and disable that. cmd save dot enabled equals false. So let's go ahead and see what happens here. Hopefully I didn't make any mistakes. Notice how when I clicked out of that, it noted that I had changed the data here and enabled our save button as desired. It's nasty. Alright, so let's hit save, disable the button for us, and hopefully if this worked, then it will have returned, that data should still be there. So let's close the program and relaunch it, and sure enough, our database value has been modified. What if we wanted to add a new value? Add a pair, and let's see, how about, well, that's a fruit, so we just added a brand new record to our table. Close out to make sure it's stuck. There it is. So it is working properly. This ID column is auto-incrementing, auto-generated, so it's not going to accept a value here. I could say 71, and I could put steak here and call it meat. And save it, and when we reopen this, you'll notice that it is just record 7. It automatically incremented, overwrote my value with its own value. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Generally, you just drop these off. You know, just query the fields. Don't use a wildcard here. So I could just, you know, build a query for food name and food type. So, can we delete a record? Select the record header here and hit your delete key and see what happens. Save out, close it, open the application, and the record is gone still. So that's working properly. Seems to be working beautifully. Record number 4 is gone. So that pretty much concludes this tutorial. There are a couple of gotchas here, things you have to keep in mind when trying to update your database from a form. I believe that you can't use a joined database query here. So if I had two tables and I had them, you know, an inner join on here like this, I don't think that you can use the update command for a join query. I think it has to be a single table query to be able to use this. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another excuse me, another thing to keep in mind is that because we're using a central SQL class here to manage our SQL connections and whatnot, if you have a larger application where you know, you're running numerous queries, what may happen is that when you try running another query, it's going to overwrite your data set with the new data, and because of that, if we attempt to update the data set that's existing in our table, you know, it might be a query for a completely different screen, that, you know, it's not going to update properly because that will not that data set will be tied to your data grid. So What you'll probably want to do is just create a copy of that, of these, the data set and maybe the DataAdapter, and just store those, in your main form. So you could, come up here, create a new private variable, foods data set, as a data set, and then set that to be equal to the other one, or a copy of it. You just copy that into this one. So if the central data set gets changed, you'll still have this one to work from. Hope that made sense. Anyway, that is how you upgrade or update a database from a data grid. I hope this has been helpful to you. I wish you all well on your projects. If you like it, share it with anybody you think that it would benefit, and give me the old thumbs up. I appreciate that. Leave comments and suggestions. Those are always welcome. I try to help out as much as I can. I'm pretty busy, so can't always help, but I like to when I can. So take care, everybody.